Shalom, welcome back. This is Dr. Dinah with Foundations in Torah, and we've been discussing the life and role of Hezekiah, and this will most likely be our last session on Hezekiah, and if you haven't listened to him previous, I would suggest that you go back and listen from the very beginning. Would like to encourage you to go to my website, foundationsintorah.com, and you can become a member at whatever level you choose. And there's lots of interesting information. I send out a weekly newsletter in which I go into great detail about aspects of the temple as we go through the various Torah portions. So last time we sort of concluded with the concept of the number 15 in Scripture and left off talking about the 15 Levitical administrators. The whole structure of the temple really was devised around the number 15. We talked about the 15 songs of ascent as the pilgrims went up to Jerusalem for the festivals. We talked about the 15 steps that were before the Nicanor gate. We talked about various prayers that were designed with the structure of 15. For instance, the priestly prayer has 15 words. So there's a lot of things related to that number 15. And in addition to that, we find the two redemptions. That would be the redemption at Passover. Speaking of the Exodus, takes place on the 15th of the first month. And then the final redemption, which would be in the fall, and the fullness of that will come at the time of Sukkot. We find that's also in the 15th, on the 15th of the seventh month. So the 15th again is very much connected with redemption and really means the highest level to worship God. And so we find this number to be very important and very valuable. Now there was something with this was in the Talmud, and it talked about that there were 15 signs of what the world would be like immediately before the coming of the Messiah. So this period that we're in is called the footsteps of the Messiah. And you can read about that in the Sotah 49b from the Talmud. And so when the footsteps of the Messiah can be heard, it is associated with this number 15 and the redemption. So I'm just going to read through these really quickly. And as I said, if you want to look further in it, you can look at it in the Sotah 49b. Anyways, insolence will increase, inflation will soar. I think you'll probably identify with most of these things. The fruit of the vine will be expensive. The dominant world power will promote the denial of God. No one will be able to reprove one another. The meeting place for Torah scholars will be used for immorality. Isn't this interesting? The Galilee will be destroyed. People who live on the border will go from town to town begging without pity. The wisdom of Torah scholars will rot. Those who fear sin will be despised. Truth will be hidden. Young people will shame old men, and man's enemies will be the members of his own household. So that's rather interesting. So I'm going to kind of change gears just a little bit, but this goes along with our concept here of the number 15, because you'll recall that those were the number of years added to the life of Hezekiah. And this Hezekiah contains that great story about the sundial of Ahaz. And you can read about that in Isaiah 38. So Hezekiah is ill to the point of death. I mentioned last time that I think he probably had some sort of staph infection, perhaps a necrotizing fasciitis in which his flesh was actually being eaten away from the inside. And so there was a sign given to him from God that he would have 15 extra years, and that he would be the city of Jerusalem would be rescued from the king of Assyria. So Isaiah asks, should the shade of the sundial move 10 degrees ahead, or should it go back? And Hezekiah responded that it's easier for the shade to be extended by 10 degrees, so therefore let the shade turn or return back 10 degrees. That is, let the shade return. So let's talk about that. The sundial of Ahaz was not a round sundial that we're used to seeing in ancient cultures. The sundial of Ahaz apparently was designed like a brick wall with stair steps on it, or brick-type steps on it. So the shadow from the sun would go up the steps of the brick. And so there were apparently stairs going up both sides of the wall, up and down. So the shadow returning 10 degrees would has a bit of a different concept than looking at it on the sundial. Of course, the number 10, very important, the number of the spiritual community, then based on the name of God, the Aleph, the number 1, any number related to that, 1, 10, 100, 1,000, points to the community as well as the God himself. And of course, we have the 10 Commandments being the epitome of that. So we read in the Targum, it says that I will bring again the shadow of the stone of hours, so that's going to be the shadow on the bricks, by which the sun is gone down on the dial of Ahaz backwards, or return it, 10 degrees. And so the sun returned 10 hours on the figure of the stone of hours in which it went down. So Hezekiah's sign is that the shadow returns, or goes back, if you will, to full sun. The question is, in this miracle, does the sun move back or does the shadow move back? If the shadow moves without the sun, that would certainly be quite a miracle. And we find that the distance of the steps wouldn't match the angle of the sun if the shadow moved back. So it is some believe then that the sun itself returned 10 degrees. And again, those degrees would be measured on the steps, the brick steps that would be on the wall. But the miracle in all this is that the shadow returns to noon, to high noon, because high noon is a picture of the kingdom of heaven, because there is no shadow or shade. Everything is real. You know that everything now is just a picture and a shadow and a type of things to come. Well, when the shadow returns to noon, at noontime there's no shadow. And so this is a picture of the fullness of the kingdom. And there's no longer any shadows. We don't live in shadows anymore. So the idea here of the shadow returning or going back is speaking of repentance. That's what's needed in order to enter the kingdom of heaven. Again, this is the concept really of teshuvah. Now, a shade or a shadow comes from the root tzel, which is a sadi and a lamed. And we look at the days of a man's life being labeled as 120 years. We have, and of course, he being created in the image of God, or in the shadow of God. It's the same word, the shadow, the shade, or the image. Betzalel, he was the master craftsman of the tabernacle. He was created, his name really means in the image of God. Yeshua, of course, come forth perfectly in the image of God. Chava, Adam's wife, Eve, was created in the image of Adam. So these images all are shadows, if you will. And so as we approach God in this concept of 15, we come closer and closer into his image. That the fullness of his image, though, will not occur until the time of the resurrection of the dead. So as we have in Colossians 2:16, the things like the festivals, Rosh Chodesh and Shabbat, are shadows of things to come. And the body is of the Messiah. So we have a picture here of Hezekiah coming into the full image of God. And that's why it's so interesting that he is this wonderful picture of the Messiah. Again, let's just read out of Colossians 3:10. It says, "You have put on the new self, which is continually being renewed in fuller and fuller knowledge, closer and closer to the image of the Creator." So the shadow returning means that we are being molded closer and closer into the image of God. We find in 1 Chronicles 29:15, it says that our days on earth are like a shadow and basically without hope. Job 8:9 tells us, again, same thing, our days on earth are but a shadow. And so all of this points to, this is our physical reality, but we are waiting for the time where the physical and the spiritual merge. Isaiah 6:4 tells us, as far as the sukkah is as a shade by day from the heat. It's the shade providing a refuge and a cover, really, from the wrath of God. Hebrews chapter 8 talks about the Kohanim and the priests serving in the physical temple, but they are pictures or shadows of the heavenly original. So Yeshua comes in the flesh. He's encased in a temporary body. In a sense, the shadow of the original, but with his resurrection, he is basically no longer a shadow. He is the real deal. Again, the shadow comes off the sundial and reflects the perfect image of God and is connected then to Hezekiah's 15 years. This is the sign of the resurrection. And the sign was that the shadow on the sundial of Ahaz returned, or teshuv, or returned back to the original. That is, the image became as the original. And as I've mentioned, the shuv concept being repentance. I think the idea of the 10 degrees probably relates to the commandments of God, the 10 commandments, returning then to the commandments of God. And Hezekiah saying, let the image return to the original. And that is the sun at noon with no shadow. So this kind of helps us make sense of Zechariah 14:6, that on that day neither bright light nor thick darkness. And one day will be neither day nor night. On that day he will be one, and his name will be one. So this is, in a sense, a day of no shadows. Now, the ultimate in shadows is Sheol, the place of the dead. That's really the place of the fullness of shadows. And so we want the reality of the full thing. And really, this concept of 15, the resurrection, really has to do with worship. It is that we come into his presence to worship and to make us one. It's God's design to elevate the community. And in that, we grab hold of the Torah and its services. And this is what leads to life. This is that the community is elevated. When Moshe, originally, when they came out of Egypt, the community was elevated as they went through the sea. So the worship, it's not just a copy or a shadow, but it's the true thing. And of course, we haven't ever really experienced that. That's our goal and our desire. One can only imagine what it's like to stand in the throne room of God in heaven and be worshiping, truly worshiping, with all those from the beginning of time. So that's our goal. And of course, Revelation speaks of that quite eloquently. We find also, let me change gears a little bit. We don't have a whole lot of time here, and I want to kind of end it with a special prayer. Let me first read this prayer from the Amidah. I read it earlier, but just as a reminder of the redemption related to Chazak, the Goel Chazak, the strong Redeemer. We're talking about the Messiah. Behold, please, our affliction, take up our grievance, and redeem us with a complete redemption speedily for your name's sake. For you are God, the Goel Chazak, the strong Redeemer. Now, there's a special prayer, and it's kind of designed around the reign of Hezekiah. It's actually from 1 Chronicles 16:8 through 36. So I would encourage you to read that entire thing. But his life, we know he had 29 years to his life, to his reign, more specifically. And it's divided into, we have 14 years on either side and then a central year. That central year is 701 BCE, and that's the year, of course, that Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, would invade. So before that, we have 14 years, which is approximately 715 BCE to 702. And then we have that year in the middle, that center year. And then we have year 700 to 786, which is another 14 years. And 14 is a very significant number in Scripture, and probably I don't have time to go into all of that, but it's looked at that the number 4 represents this physical world in which we live, and then when you add the number 1 to it, which represents God, this creates the number 5, which represents the Messianic age, or the world to come, or that this world has been transformed by God himself. So here we sit with these two periods of 14 years. This is also a number used when you are reading in Matthew, first chapter, the generations. You'll find that there are 3 groups of 14 years of the generations. Also in Numbers, the camps in the wilderness, there were 3 groups of 14 camps. So 14 has to do with elevating the natural world to the spiritual. And so we have these 14 years on either side of this central year in 701 BCE, which is really the year that represents the redemption. So this is the division of Hezekiah's reign based on the 29 years that he did reign. And now this particular prayer that is recited most mornings, 1 Chronicles 16, 8 through 36, is actually 29 verses. So it's kind of interesting because it is patterned after Hezekiah's life. And we find that there's a division in those verses, that there are 15 in the first half and 14 in the second half. And both of this division in these verses, of these 29 verses, has to do with the redemption. So the redemption of the past, which would be the redemption in Egypt, is patterned after the first 15 verses of 1 Chronicles 16, 8 through 36. This particular prayer is part of a group called the Pesukei de Zimra, which means the verses of praise, but can also mean the verses of pruning, because it prunes us before we enter into our special prayers, the Shema and the Amidah. But again, patterned after the reign of Hezekiah. And so the second 14 verses, the 15 first and the 14 second, speak of the redemption of the future. So the redemption of the past is in the first part, and the redemption of the future is in the second part, pointing to this battle between Assyria and Hezekiah, pointing to the time of Sukkot. You can find this one in 1 Chronicles also in Psalm 96. So the last 14 verses were sung in the tabernacle during the afternoon service, and the first 15 verses were sung in the tabernacle during the morning service. So this is really a theme in the story of Hezekiah. And it speaks then of God's salvation from exile and persecution from all Israel's enemies, and ultimately a picture of the reign of Yeshua. Now, this particular psalm was sung by David when he brought the ark and set it up inside into the temple. Of course, he had a tent pitched by where he lived at first, and so the temple was not constructed until the time of Solomon. But in that tent that David pitched in Jerusalem is where he put the ark. So again, the 29 verses form this sort of jubilant song that David, it was said, taught to Asaph. Now Asaph and his family were the chief musicians and psalmists. And again, the song was intended to be sung when the ark, the holy ark, was being brought up to Jerusalem. So it certainly is something that signifies the very presence of God. And again, the first 15 verses were sung in the tabernacle during the morning service. So at the time of the Shacharit service in the morning, the first half was sung. And it spoke about the miracles of the past and also really the faith of the patriarchs. And so let me just kind of run through this basically. It's 1 Chronicles 8 through 36, the verses of praise. Verses 8 through 22 is the morning, 15 verses. You can also read it in Psalm 105, sung in the morning service again. The afternoon service was verses 23 through 36. It was 14 verses. It's also found in Psalm 96 and sung in the afternoon. Now, I know those are a lot of numbers, so just kind of bear with me. But again, 1 Chronicles 16, 8 through 36, and you can count that out and go through and you'll see this division between the 15 and the 14. And this was really a very special prayer then, and it is this prayer that would purge all the hindrances and distractions as we enter into the presence of God. So the concept of prayer, and certainly goes back to the temple and all the various psalms. Certainly one of the psalms, "Sing to the Lord, everyone on earth," is how this 1 Chronicles 8:16 begins. It starts that way, and it's a song of gratitude that basically everyone will sing in Messianic times. And it is most likely referring to the salvation from our enemy, Assyria, who certainly was the enemy in the past at the time of Hezekiah, but it's also a picture of our future enemy. So all through this psalm, God's glory is seen and described in creation as the events of this song are unfolding. And it's a song that calls upon Israel to maintain their faith, their trust, their confidence in God, that He will bring about salvation from exile and from persecution. And He will bring deliverance from the greatest enemy of all. Certainly, Assyria was a great enemy and threat to Hezekiah, but the greatest enemy of all is death. And so the promise here is that God will bring salvation from death, our great enemy, and that he will restore and return Israel and bring her out of exile and remove the persecution. Now, when you get to some of the songs, the Halim you might be familiar with, they were sung on the 15 steps themselves during the festival time. So, for instance, at Passover, those of you who are familiar with the Passover Seder, you'll note that Psalms from the Halim 113 and 114 are said or sung before the meal with the first 2 cups of wine, and then after the meal, later in the service, the remaining Psalms 115 through 118 are sung. And of course, the Passover lambs were being offered at the time at this time as the Halim would be sung, and these praises would be sung to the point of exaltation, and in fact, including 1 Chronicles 16, 8 through 36. And we find that was sung at the time of the second Passover in Hezekiah, because there was a preparation for that. So all this, it definitely relates to this time of prayer and restoration and the services in the temple. Very important to learn as much as you can about the services in the temple, because they were basically, the words of our lips have become a substitute for the reality that was the first and second temple. And there's no question that we're waiting for the temple to be reestablished and rededicated. And those same psalms and expressions that are from the psalm, which is really the hymnal, if you will, for the second temple period, will find that same expression. So all of this connects to the life of Hezekiah. Again, a very deep and rich life, maybe not much said about him in the scriptures, but so many of the things connect quite amazingly to the life of Hezekiah. And so that really pointing us again to this concept of redemption. Redemption in the past, the time of Egypt when the children of Israel came out of Egypt, associated with the first half of that particular prayer from 1 Chronicles 16, and the redemption of the future. And that, of course, is going to take place at the time of Sukkot, and we believe that this attack by the king of Assyria against Hezekiah is pictured in that time of the future, going to Gog and Magog. So all of these things are related one to another. So as we close out this wonderful adventure in the life of Hezekiah, 2 quotes I'd like to just kind of close with, because this is how it really all started. This is what got me thinking that there's obviously more here about the life of Hezekiah, than what first meets the eye. And that's because the sages said that the Holy One wished to appoint Hezekiah as the Messiah and Sennacherib as Gog and Magog. So that just is setting us up with Hezekiah's nemesis, King Sennacherib of Assyria. Of course, that pattern plays itself out in every generation with every king. But Hezekiah is very unique in that regard. And so the sages definitely made that connection. Now, one last quote from Rabbi Hillel. He said that there will be no more Messiah for Israel because they've already enjoyed him in the days of Hezekiah. So they were so convinced that Hezekiah was the Messiah, they didn't even believe another one would be coming, because he already fulfilled everything that needed to be fulfilled. So that's kind of the conclusion of this whole story. We have covered a lot of ground. There's many patterns in the life of Hezekiah, including the festivals. We've gone into detail through the Passover season and Sukkot and Hanukkah, all those things fitting into Hezekiah's life. The whole pattern of redemption at Passover and Sukkot fitting into his life, a pattern for prayer. We have the imagery. I've talked a little bit of the fig tree, the virgin birth. He was, of course, the king of Judah who was resurrected. A picture of the resurrection in his additional 15 years. He defeated the king of Assyria. We had that experience where his flesh, when he was to die, is probably his flesh being consumed like the Messiah. The copper serpent on the pole, and this whole idea of shadows versus the real thing. So this is truly a great example Yeshua the Messiah and the work that he accomplished through the life of Hezekiah the Messiah. So his life too speaks to us that we won't live without hope, that our hope and crown is in the Messiah. So I'd just like you to check out the website, Foundations in Torah, when you get a chance, and hope you'll be listening next time as we talk about something new and different. Shalom.